Hey, everybody. Before we start the show, I wanted to talk about a couple things. First is, if you have some spare cash right now, I do have a Kickstarter ongoing, but first I would actually encourage you to donate to one of many, many organizations like the Bail Project, Black Lives Matter, Campaign Zero, Police Use of Force Project, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, or Communities United Against Police Brutality. The reason is because right now our country is going through some pain, and for decades and decades and decades, we have been dealing with a lot of racial injustice, basically since before this country was even a country here in America. So if you have some spare dollars, I totally recommend that you go and check out one of these great organizations, or several other. Code 2040 is a great one to check out, and you go ahead and donate some money to them if you can, because it is going to be a big help. These are the organizations that are doing a lot to fight racial injustice in America right now, and also to help reform the police, which I think is an important topic, and I think is going to help save some lives. So please do me a favor and go check out one of those projects. Okay, let's start the show. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. Chris and Matt are here on the show today, and we are talking about Wretched and Alone. Wretched and Alone, which is a totally awesome game system for creating your own solo RPGs about isolation, fear, and so much more. Now, we are talking about a game jam that is going right now on itch. We'll get into what all of these things mean in the interview, but I do want to say that the game jam has been extended since we've done this interview. It is going until June 29th at 7 p.m. So June 29th at 7 p.m. You've got plenty of time if you want to contribute to this game jam to write a game. I plan on contributing at least one. I now have several ideas after talking to Chris and Matt. I also wanted to let you know that Chris and Matt have put together a special Wretched and Alone Tabletop Babble bundle just for you, our listeners. It includes Go Alone, which is one of the games that we talked about. It's by Chris. And Matt's game, Fake Guru Real Vice. You can get the whole bundle for $5 on itch. This is a steal. We are going to link it over in the show notes at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com. Go check it out. So here is my interview with them. Okay, everybody, now I'm here with two game design geniuses who are on the cutting edge of tabletop role-playing game design. It's really exciting to have you both here. Chris and Matt, welcome to Tabletop Babble. For people who don't know, who are you? What do you do in the world of tabletop RPGs? Chris, let's start with you.
Cool. Thank you so much for having us. I am Chris Bissett. I run Loot the Room, a website one or two people might have heard of, and I write games. I'm so bad at selling myself.
Loot the Room is a great blog that I read a lot and has very, very good advice about game design and running games. So people should definitely check that out. It is one of my favorite to read. So
yeah, listen to James, not me.
And also a multi-itch bestseller, Chris.
Apparently so, as of like last week. Yeah, I got it out from D&D, and it has it's paid off.
Yeah, in a big way, and that is awesome to see. And Matt, who are you, and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
So my name's Matt Sanders. I've worked with Chris quite a lot in the past, but I don't run a blog as such. In the past, I used to design a lot of stuff for systems like D&D, some kind of content generation stuff, and a couple of adventures. But more recently, I've moved towards kind of either my own games or a few of the things I've put out on itch are like subsystems that you can use in another game or play on their own potentially. So they're kind of very like DIY or kit bash friendly, and that's the thing I'm kind of driving towards more and more as we go on.
Yeah, this is so exciting because you two are kind of at the front of, with many, many designers as well, right? At the front of this movement of like people branching out from D&D, which I remember like 2 years ago when 5th edition D&D was really blowing up and a lot of people were designing for it. I remember talking to some game designers and them saying like, 2 years from now, we're going to see a lot of these people branch out and start to make other games because we're going to see more people say like, okay, I've tried D&D, what else is out there? I want to try more things. And so we're going to see consumers hungry for that content, and we're going to see designers who are like, I've designed for D&D, I know D&D, what else can I do? Can I make my own thing? And I think you have proven the answer is yes. Yes, you can. So I want to talk a little bit about Wretched and Alone, right? At the time we're recording this, you have a game jam going on. Let's talk about the inception of the original game first. So do you want to talk about that, Chris, first? Like, how did all this start?
This, as all my best ideas do, came from a complete post on Twitter where I was like, I've been going through a heavy John Carpenter phase, and I was watching like The Thing and Escape from New York, and I was getting really into that whole aesthetic. And like, I tweeted that I wanted to make a game that played the way a John Carpenter soundtrack sounds, and I didn't actually know what that meant. Ben Chong, who publishes as Swords and Flowers, who's one of my favorite game designers, replied with a link to his game Monologue, which is a Jenga-based game about a spaceship in a space fight that looks and feels like a John Carpenter soundtrack. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. I want to do this. And then I just started thinking about, like, obviously at the time we're recording this, there's like a global pandemic going on and everyone's in isolation and playing games on their own. And it was one of those things where just like this combination of ideas came together, and I wrote this game called The Wretched that is about, it's Alien. I stole the entire plot from Alien. You're Ellen Ripley on the Nostromo trying to fix the ship and not get eaten by an alien. But I made this game where it's a solo journaling RPG, played with a Jenga tower and dice and some cards where you record your daily logs. And I wrote a soundtrack for it, and I just threw it online and thought, this was fun. This was a nice weekend project. We'll see what happens. And next thing I knew, it was like an itch bestseller and taking off. And there's people posting their daily logs online and posted it to Reddit where people actually liked it and wanted to pay for it instead of telling me I was the worst person in the world for wanting money for my work. And it's been a crazy month.
Yeah, and well deserved. It is a really beautifully, elegantly designed game that I think everybody should go check out. And then you put out an SRD for it.
Yeah, that was largely Matt's idea. Like I said, we've worked together quite a bit in the past, and we talk very regularly. And he'd said he wanted to write a game like The Wretched that used those mechanics and things. And I think in the process of, obviously he can talk more about the process of it, but in the process of writing the Sealed Library, which is the game he put out, he kind of broke The Wretched down into its constituent parts to see how it worked and which bits he could pull on and twist to make things work differently. And so he kind of wrote an SRD for himself, and then we were like, well, maybe we should just put this out for people to play with. It felt like a really big, like, ego-driven move to say, I've written a game and here's how you can do it too. People were legitimately asking for it as well, and I'm really glad that Matt had the idea to do it, because I wouldn't have done it without his push. So
yeah. So Matt, tell me, how did this all come about? How did you get the idea for the SRD, and then how did you go about putting it together?
So when I came back to kind of publishing RPG stuff and switched away from like DMG and drive-through, I started publishing on itch, and I did that under the name Sealed Library. And it was always my intention to do either a game or a supplement or something that used that name as the name of the supplement as well as the name of how I'm publishing under itch. And then when Chris published The Wretched, it basically fitted really nicely with one of the ideas I had bouncing around for that, this idea of, a librarian trapped in a library that's going to be destroyed, like a great library of history akin to the Library of Alexandria or something. And The Wretched was like the mechanics I needed for that, finished effectively. I just needed to write a different set of prompts for it. So essentially I suggested to Chris, well, I want to do this and I want to use that. And if we do, why not make it a bigger thing and allow other people to do it? I think the idea really came from Nate Dream, who'd run a jam for a game of his that had like, small game. It had like 70 submissions or something. And that made me think, well, yeah, okay, there's no reason we can't do that. So while I was writing the sealed library, simultaneously, I was kind of figuring out how the components parts fitted together and writing that down to make into an SRD.
Wow, that's awesome. That's really, really cool. And so people can check out, the original games, the Wretched and the Sealed Library that are currently on itch. And then you two have now a game jam that, again, at the time of recording this has looks like 75 people who have joined so far, which is huge. That's great.
Yeah, I remember the day before it launched, I said to Chris, well, we're both going to write another Wretched Alone game. So even if nobody joins, there'll at least be 4, and that'll be fine. and we're already well past that, and I think we're both pretty pleased with that.
We are. Because even the jam was a last minute, like, oh, we're releasing the SRD. Should we do a game jam? Yeah, sure. Why not? Let's do a game jam. And like, we're a week into it at this point, and we've had, 10 entries? 9 if you don't count my one that I released. Because, I don't think I'd count in my own game jam.
I think so. You made a game. Like that gets, because you made another game called Go Alone, yes. Right? And what's that one? What's sort of the flavor and theme?
That is my love letter to top-down Zelda-like games and roguelikes, and to every magic sword in every game I've ever played in my life. And it was just about, I swear I'm just channeling my mood into these games at the minute. It's about a sword that has been used and discarded for centuries and decades, a sentient sword that's spent its life sitting alone in the dark places of the world and then being picked up and used to kill people and then discarded again. And it's about just wanting to retire, have a rest for once in its life. So the aim is that you've been picked up by a new bearer, and you just want to convince them to hang you up above a mantelpiece somewhere and let you sleep for a century or so.
Wow. I never thought about like Zelda from the perspective of the Master Sword. That's great. I love that. So, we've talked a lot about like sort of the games that are part of this, and there's a lot of really great designers who have partaken in this. Oliver Clegg, Kat Evans, those are just some of the people who people might know from D&D, or, Kat's worked on a bunch of different things, and now they are part of this game jam, right? And I imagine we're going to see even more coming in. So that's great. But what is, like, I think a lot of people may not be familiar with a solo journaling RPG. What is that?
Yeah, I'm relatively new to them as a genre, but I kind of latched onto them really quickly. I really love them, I think, because I fundamentally don't like being around people. I don't like spending time in bed. I see them as guided creative writing exercises in a lot of ways. It's just very pure role-playing on your own. You're given lists of prompts and maybe a mood and kind of an idea of who you are as a character, and you're told to just go and create a story yourself a lot of the time. My mind has just gone completely blank on any of the games that I've been playing recently. The Adventurer.
Yeah.
It's a great game where you are an adventurer on a journey, and you write a journal every day. You pull cards and it tells you that you're on a coastline and you've found a dead body and some dangerous terrain, and you're left to just go nuts with it. And I think as a writer and as a creator, it's very liberating to play a game that says, just go and create, and you don't need to, no one's going to see this. This is just for you. Something really pure about that I really resonate with.
Yeah, it's journaling is very cool, and so is stepping into a fantasy world or the shoes of a fictional character, right? And so, like, combining those to say, here's this very personal thing that you can do, but you have the freedom to be someone else and sort of explore the ideas of being a sentient sword, right? And what does that mean? I think is really cool. You know, Matt, you sort of broke the game down into its components. You broke the Wretched down for the SRD. What are some of the like mechanics that drive these writing prompts, specifically with the Wretched Alone SRD?
So a big component of it that really I think appears in pretty much most solo games is the Oracle. And that's really the core thing that where all of the themes that the writer wants to get in there will appear. In Wretched and Alone games, those are driven by a deck of cards where you will draw from the deck and you'll get a prompt. And that might describe an event that happens. It might give you a question to reflect on about the experience you're in. And it might even help world build. It might ask you to define an aspect of the character you're currently playing. And then those are what inform the journal that you create. So they really provide a theme kind of fitting set of things that allow you to kind of create a much more specific experience than most RPGs. Like I think most games we play as RPGs are really generalist and they're a toolbox for simulating a whole bunch of experiences. And this is way narrower. This is defining this tiny, narrow, singular experience in a really specific way and exploring what it is with specific tools instead of generalist ones.
Yeah, and it's I think it's a great muscle for people to stretch either as players, right? Like to sit down and play one of these games, I think is just a great exercise that is fun and is a game, right? Like you're playing a game when you do this, which is really cool. And it also ups your game, I feel like, for other role-playing games. And also as a designer, I think it's great to design things, even if your bag is something like D&D most of the time, because you learn more about game design, I feel like, when you're designing towards a specific goal.
Well, can I talk about one of the jam entries that's coming that I think fits really well for D&D players?
Sure, yeah.
I'm doing something totally different. So, you know, Diogo, who runs Old Skull?
Yes.
Yeah. He's planning on doing a Wretched Jam game that kind of simulates like an iconic scene from Lord of the Rings where the dwarves are trapped inside Moria and the orcs are they've got them under siege. And in Lord of the Rings, you see them find that book. There's this diary of what happened to the dwarves. It's creating that. And there's no way that D&D could simulate the same thing.
Right.
You know, you could simulate the fights and this kind of really thrilling aspect of it in D&D, and it'd be really great. But Wretched Alone lets you do a different thing. It lets you simulate the downtime those dwarves experience where they sit and write down what happens to them, and you get this totally different product out of the same series of events. And I think that's something that I'm really excited about for that game specifically, because it offers that D&D player something they recognize, but it's totally new.
Yeah, I love this because I was thinking about, you know, in Go Alone, that sapient sword, right? The idea of like, I as a DM am going to sit down and I'm going to play Go Alone, and then I will have this whole kind of history and attitude and the fully shaped idea in this weapon that then maybe my players find and is pissed off about being picked up, right? In my game of 13th Age or D&D or Pathfinder or whatever it is.
And the journal you've created, it can even become an in-game artifact in something else.
Yes. Like imagine playing the Wretched and you find this, you know, you're playing the Alien RPG and you find a space log that is someone's game of the Wretched, right?
Exactly. So the DM's playthrough of the Wretched is your session 0 of your Alien RPG.
Yeah. Someone had posted on Reddit that they were using the Wretched to generate material for their Starfinder game.
Whoa.
Because they had people finding empty abandoned ships and they were creating logs that their players were going to go into these ships and find using the Wretched, and that blew my mind.
That's great.
Yeah, but from that perspective, it is a perfect derelict starship generator.
It is a perfect derelict starship generator.
Yeah. That is so cool. That's great. So how does the tower play in, right? There's a Jenga tower
there is.
that is involved, right?
So Jenga towers are a really, really cool mechanic. What we've found with Wretched Alone is that it does a very good job of emulating genre, like movie genres. And I think that's down to the Jenga Tower, because what the Jenga Tower is really excellent at is creating a sense of rising tension and rising stakes. Like you look at everyone's favorite Jenga RPG, Dread, which you're playing through a slasher movie effectively, because at some point that tower is going to fall. It's like the old thing about the best way to create dramatic tension is to show someone a gun under a table that the characters don't know about. You know, you as a player know that at some point this Jenga tower is going to fall and the game's over. In the Wretched, the tower represents the alien creature eating you. In Go Alone, it represents you as a sword physically breaking in combat. Seal Library represents the attackers who have tried to get through your barricades, getting into the library and burning it to the ground. So you know from the word go that you're probably going to die and the game is going to end. And it's just a matter of how long can you survive before that tower falls down and what story can you tell. And I think the tactile physical aspect of seeing the tower teetering and knowing that your story is coming to an end is really effective.
Yeah, it really is. It's great, and that's kind of a great way to increase the tension for you as you're writing, right? Like, oh, okay, I can see this tower's coming down, and so I've got to decide, right? This could be my last entry before the tower falls. What is my character gonna do? That's awesome. I know there's another RPG called Starcrossed that uses it, and it's a 2-player, but it uses it to like simulate a relationship and kind of the baggage of a romantic relationship and things, getting more and more tense until you get to this breaking point. So, which is a kind of an interesting way of looking at relationships, right?
I think it's one of those things where you say, like, people who have maybe only played like your traditional pen and paper dice-based games look at a Jenga tower and think, oh, that's a toy and that's not a mechanic, but it's a really, really versatile tool that lets you tell a ton of stories.
It's so much less swingy than dice. When we've looked at ways to, for people who don't have a Jenga tower to play and try and simulate that rising tension with dice, it's really hard because dice are so random. I mean, it's their purpose, but it has a limit. But when you don't want something random, it's hard to achieve with dice, and a Jenga tower does that totally well.
So do you all, do you have some favorite entries so far in this jam that you're excited about? Obviously, they're all great. Let's just lay that out there, right? Like there's no bad one that you're going to
find. No, I haven't seen a game in the jam yet that I haven't fallen in love with. I really love Kat Evans' Final Girl, because I was playing with those kind of tropes for games myself as well, but she's done such a good job of it, of emulating just that classic slasher horror masked killer vibe. And Saverick, who is actually my DM in a game that I play every couple of weeks on Twitch, is just released his first ever game using the system, which is awesome. And it's called Echoes, and it's basically his love letter to Silent Hill. You receive a letter from a departed loved one that tells you to come to this town, and you're searching for like evidence of what remains of them. And it just delves deep into real like survival horror and existentialism. And it's so moody. There's like atmosphere falling off the page of this game. I really love it.
Wow, that's cool. I definitely want to check that one out. And that's the one that's about to surpass Honey Heist, right?
Yeah, he's one behind Honey Heist. He's about to be there.
That's exciting.
I think he will too. I think that'll happen. That looks really slick, Echoes. It's got a really nice aesthetic to it, but I think people will recognize for what it is.
Hey everyone, we're going to take a quick break and then back to the babble.
Leave behind the safety of the Humblewood and travel down the Tangrip coast to the Bay of Palouche, home to both the Kingdom of Den and the Serpent Domain. But neither hold the true power of the Bay, for that lies in the sea itself and the pirate lords that call her tides their own. The dread pirate Captain Bluebeak, Tiberius Fang, Kin the Bladeless, and Gabrielle LaFleur, the self-proclaimed pirate queen. each one vying for power over the very tides themselves. But do any of them really have what it takes to hold up the legacy of the briny bulldog? Tune in each week to find out if our little crew has what it takes to stand up to the pirates of the blood-soaked waters. Dark Fortunes is available every Monday on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play. Set sail for high seas adventure.
Let's get back to the babble. So how did you all make the decision to start branching out? In fact, actually, let's go back even further. Like, tell me about how you got started designing games, period. Like, how did you get started writing and working with RPG supplements and games and stuff?
So I was out of RPGs for a long time. I was into them as a teen and got back into them when I was about 30. And I was really actually looking for a creative outlet. That was one of the key things about it. Essentially, a lot of the stuff I read, I was like, oh, well, I have this thing I want to add to this. And that was the beginning of it. I had something I wanted to add, and I wrote it down. And I'd learned about how low the barrier to entry had become for people to make games and put them out into the world. So I started on Drive-Thru and Twitter, and I met a lot of other people who were enthusiastic about games and some of the things I was doing, and it really went from there.
Nice. That's great. How about you, Chris?
Mine's almost the standard story. You know, I started playing D&D when I was a kid, when I was like 8 years old, and I think everyone who plays RPGs writes stuff for them. And then when I got to uni, late teens and early 20s, third edition had been out a couple of years, and I'd started writing. I was really bored. I wasn't engaged with my course at all, and I just wanted to do something creative. So I started publishing little zines of third edition stuff under the OGL, just with little print runs of 25, 30 copies of things that I sold at small conventions and to the RPG Society and stuff like that. And then when fourth edition came out, I lost my group because everyone wanted to play fourth edition, and I didn't. I wanted to stick with third ed, so I threw my toys out the pram and decided I wasn't going to play at all if I couldn't play third ed. So I kind of sat at home for years writing all this stuff that no one ever saw, and effectively playing D&D on my own. And it was when fifth ed came out and sites like the DMs Guild popped up, and like Matt said, the barrier for entry just got stupidly low. That I started getting back into it, and it just kind of snowballed from there. Like, I published stuff, and then I started Loot the Room, and then people started taking notice of it, and I was like, well, I guess I'm doing this now.
Yeah, that's how it happens. Like, oh, I guess this is a thing that I do, and
people want to keep doing this. I guess I can't stop now.
That's great. And now you have both sort of branched out. Were you at all nervous of like, are people going to follow me to? Because I am about to release a role-playing game on Roll20 called Burn Bright. It's like an original role-playing game, right? Yeah. And it's sci-fi, and it's like, this is not what people expect from me at all, right? Like, I'm a D&D guy, I think is what they think of me as, right? And I've poured years of work into this, so I'm nervous. Were you at all nervous making that leap out of D&D?
It sounds arrogant to say no.
No, I like that. I like to hear that. Yes.
I wasn't, because essentially I had this belief that just as I wanted more and different from what RPGs did, so will other people. And I think I believed that, because when you introduce new people to D&D, it's a totally new thing to them, and you can see they latch on to the idea of it really quickly. And I don't see any reason at all why people who already play D&D or Pathfinder or Call of Cthulhu or any of these kind of big monolithic classic systems, that they won't enjoy something new, because at some point playing that RPG was new to them and it grabbed them, and so can something else.
Yeah, I agree. I've got a really big board gaming background as well as the role-playing games, and no board gamer just plays one board game, right? There's nobody in the world who just plays Settlers of Catan or just plays Carcassonne, you know? Maybe there's someone who just plays Twilight Imperium because they're still playing that one game. But I think it's endemic to D&D players that they only play D&D a lot of the time. Outside of D&D, role-playing gamers are very willing to try other systems and play other systems. So I had a bit of trepidation about branching out, but at this point, I'm kind of making stuff that I want to make anyway. So if people latch onto it, that's great. And if they don't, I'm going to play these games. So at least someone will be.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I think is a barrier to entry is for most people, their first game is something like D&D or Pathfinder, which have these massive, massive rule books. And so it is intimidating. It's like, oh, I have to do homework if I'm going to learn a new system, right? But there are RPGs where the rules are, they're shorter than Settlers of Catan. They're shorter than Monopoly. And I think it's important to, for us as designers to keep that in mind, right? That like, hey, there are other ways to get in other than saying, read this giant rule book to learn my game.
Yeah, I mean, look at Honey Heist.
Yeah.
Like my partner has never played a game, and she's not really interested in D&D. But when I said, "Oh, there's this game that it's one page and you get to be a bear wearing a hat," she's like, "Yeah, sign me up. When can we play
it?" Yeah, it was the same thing for me, right? I had played D&D with my wife a couple of times, right? And she was like, wow, that's a lot of rules and like a lot to keep track of. And then with some friends wanted to play Monster of the Week, right? And we sat down and she was, yeah, it's great. And she was watching Buffy and it was like, oh, this is so much simpler, right? And even Monster of the Week is a pretty, as far as role-playing games go, can be Apocalypse, powered by the Apocalypse games can be robust, right? They can be something like a Wretched Alone game, I think is great because you're sort of following the rules as you go to play too. It's just great to see more games like this. And I think I think right now in this pandemic, when we're all kind of isolated and we might be going to work, but we're not like going to parties or anything like that afterwards. Chris, it's probably been a while since you played a gig, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, I think our last gig was last year. I can't even remember the last time I was on a stage.
Wow, holy crap. So like it's good to have games like this that we can play and we don't have to buy a Nintendo Switch to make happen, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which no offense, no, Nintendo Switch is great if you've got it, so it's good stuff. Matt, you were talking a lot about the mechanics of the Wretched Alone SRD driving you towards something specific, right? Instead of a more generalist system, right? And I see that a lot in in indie RPGs that people sort of have this like, you know what, you can't do everything in this game. This game is about doing this, right? This game is about telling this sort of specific story, and within the parameters you can totally play and feel free to break the game into a new game if you want to, right? But like this is what it's about. What sort of tips do you have and what have you learned about designing games in that fashion? Chris, I'm going to ask you the same thing. So
for me, a real revelation that came from other games once I started kind of reading more systems was essentially sharing far more of the game with the players, like allowing for far more player input into things so that they've got that control. Because I think a lot of systems, you put this massive burden of creativity and like managing everything on the person running the game. And it just doesn't have to be like that. So I think when you're designing stuff, I think looking at, well, okay, what are all the decisions that are being made here and who should be making them? And then how can I get them into the hands of the players in a way that moves the game forward? My first thing that I published like that was my first thing that I published on Itch, which is it's basically just an encounter generator mashed together with the kind of everybody writing something on a Post-it note and then jamming it all together. It's basically a party game for creating like one-shot encounters. And that was done from just saying, well, what about the player decides these things instead?
It's really interesting, right? Because one of the, if you've ever played 10 Candles, one of the things about that game is like the players kind of determine what happens between scenes, right? Like they state facts that they know to be true. And I remember when I first played it with a group of friends, the whole point of 10 Candles is you're all going to die eventually, right? Like eventually everybody's candle goes out, is kind of the thing. And as we were playing, all of the players who were primarily D&D players were going around and saying like, oh, we find this thing that helps us survive, and we get this, this, we're victorious in this way, and we have all these boons. And it was like, this game is going on forever because people aren't leaning into the aesthetic of like, this is a horror game where you're supposed to die and bad things should happen, right? How about you, Chris? What have you learned about sort of the specifics of game design?
God, such a hard question, especially when Matt gave such a good answer. Yeah.
What do you mean? I just promoted one of my games. That was all I did.
Yeah, there you go. That's all you got to do.
I think we have a tendency to overcomplicate a lot of things. And one of the reasons that I think Matt and I have worked together so often is because we tend to have similar ideas and opinions about the way things should work. So my answer is going to sound a lot like his. And that's not just because I listened to him and I'm now regurgitating what he said.
I gotcha.
I promise. Yeah, I think we do tend to, especially coming from a really strong D&D background, we do tend to overcomplicate and want to kind of mechanize everything. We want to have rules in place for everything. And there's not really any need for that. If you trust your players to engage in a game that's going to be satisfying and fun for them, you can write a game that just gives people a mood and a vague instruction, and people will go away and play games. Children do this all the time. And I think as we get older, we lose a sense of what it is to play, and we want to have instructions on how to do things. And I think there's something really liberating about writing a game that says to a player, just go and play. And I think that's something that rules light games do really well. Like one of my favorite games is A Scoundrel in the Deep, which is for 2 players, where one of you is the scoundrel who has ventured into a dungeon and stolen something and is trying to escape. And one of you is the deep, which is the world. And you play it by passing a lit candle a lit match even back and forth and telling the story of what happens. And there's no real rules in place. You pass the story back and forth along with the flame. And when it goes out, things happen. And you just tell a story together. And I think it's real, like shared storytelling is our cultural heritage wherever you're from, and I think we've lost sight of that somewhere, and having these really small games that allow us to get back to that, I think is really important.
Arguments about rules only happen in games that have a lot of them.
Yes.
So you pick something like Pathfinder, where you can have like 3 feet of books with complicated systems for every conceivable situation, and people will argue about how something works. And you create a simple system. We say, well, if you're not sure, just roll some dice and decide what happens. Do those arguments go away because it gets it back to shared storytelling instead of arguing about numbers, and it makes it way more what I come to the hobby for and way more enjoyable for me.
Yeah. I think there's there's an interview with Monty Cook, right, where somebody asked him about 3rd edition, and they were like, 3rd edition D&D has rules for everything, right? And the Cypher system, which is still in the grand scheme of games, right, is still a pretty rules heavy game, but is definitely a much lighter and more flexible system than D&D, right? Than 3rd edition D&D. And he said, our philosophy back then, which has changed, was if you want a game that lets you do everything, you need a rule for everything, right? And he said that's clearly not true. Like we've now figured out, and some people knew all along that like this was not the case, right? That what you really need are to be able to, exactly what you all said, set a mood and give people the tools to tell the stories that they want to tell. And I think the more games we have that are rules light, the more those are actually better entry points, I think, for a lot of people into role-playing games.
100%. I think one of the things I've definitely learned is that the things you build mechanics for are when you have mechanics in place or something, you're telling the player this is what's important about this game. So D&D functionally is a combat simulator, and it hand waves away any kind of social interactions and doesn't really put rules in place for them. It has skills for it because D&D thinks it should have rules for everything, but it doesn't really have rules beyond roll a deception check, you know? And that's why D&D the games tend to be, we go into the dungeon and we kill everything that's there and we take their stuff. Whereas if you strip out the combat mechanics and instead build a really robust framework for social interaction, you have an entirely different game.
Yeah, and even, one of the best ways to look at a game and to see what is this game about is what does it reward, right? How do your players level up? And it's like, well, inherently in D&D, monsters are worth experience points. Now, yes, there are alternate systems, and you can, like any role-playing game, you can play a different way. But if you look at that, that like at least every class, 70%, probably 80 or 90% of their class features are combat related, right? The spells, whatever percentage of the spells seem to be meant for killing something, right? Or dazing something or whatever it is, right? You can see this is definitely a game about combat. And I think sometimes people hear that and think like, well, then you're saying it's not a role-playing game. And I don't think you are when you say that. I think you're just acknowledging that this is what this game is about, and that's fine. It's fine to have fun killing monsters, right? Like,
yeah, I think one of the things that kind of led me to getting away from D&D design, I mean, I still love it, and I'm still going to write stuff for it because I always want to, but the bits of the Player's Handbook for 5th edition that I engaged with the most were trinket tables and backgrounds, and they're the least mechanically important parts of the game, and they're the bits that I enjoy the most. So that tells me that I should be writing for something else.
Earlier, when I said that, I found when I read stuff, I wanted to add to it. I wanted to do more with it. That's exactly what Chris has just said. I found the bits of the book I engaged with were the bits that were least fleshed out. And I wanted to flesh those out more. And I didn't feel like I had anything to add to the list of combat stuff. It's all there.
Yeah, I've never built a class for D&D.
Sure, because it's a lot of it's covered, right? It's I often find when I'm designing a player option, which is rare for me, right? I'm more about when I go into combat, I usually approach it from the DM side, probably because I DM a lot. But like monsters and things like that, and it's usually because like I can find a cool story for a monster, right? And so it's the same thing of when I do sit down to design a player option, I'll like inevitably it takes me 3 or 4 times because what I designed already exists in some form, right? I'm like, oh, I made this a feat, but it already exists as a rogue thing, or it already exists as a. So yeah, I'm with you there. I'm excited because I feel like I'm at a precipice where I want to jump off and design more things, especially after working on Burn Bright. And you two are very inspiring in that way, and I look up to you in this field of design. So I think it's great to be able to just sit here and jam and talk about games and everything. So if people want to know more about you both, find you online, where should they go and what should they do? Chris, let's start with you.
So I live on Twitter. So you can always get me on Twitter, twitter.com/pangalactic, like the drink in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And you can find my website, loottheroom.uk, where I post random roll tables and stuff like that. And I've always got something going on over there as well.
Excellent. And what about Matt? Where can people find you?
So my username on pretty much everything is always the same. It's I am Matt Sanders, like a very simple existential statement.
Excellent.
The only place I use anything different to that at the moment is Itch, where I go by Sealed Library, just to kind of keep that as like an RPG thing and to allow me to potentially publish some other people's stuff on it at some point as well, but it won't just then have my name on as well. And like Chris, I live on Twitter. I spend a great deal of time there. I think for RPGs, it's the best space, despite all its problems. I still think it's where the good stuff happens.
I agree with that 100%. It is the best space, and it could be better.
Yeah, exactly.
So, when does the Wretched Alone Game Jam end?
13th of June, right?
13th of June. So let's say this podcast drops on the 8th of June. Do you think that people could, in 5 days after hearing this podcast, create a Wretched and Alone game?
From inception to final product, the Wretched took me 2.5 days, and Go Alone took a similar amount of time. So yeah, absolutely.
There you go. You can do it. And this man has a full-time job. So
yes, this was done at my full-time job.
There you go. So you can definitely make this happen, and you should participate. Man, I got to see if I can find the time to get something up there. So
I would love for you to get involved, man. If you get a chance, that would be amazing.
You two have really, really inspired me here, and I really want to partake. Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for joining me on Tabletop Babble. I appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Hey, I wanted to let you know that right now I have a Kickstarter going on with Mike Shea and Scott Gray. It's for Fantastic Lairs, and you can help create a book of awesome boss battles for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So head on over to Kickstarter or to fantasticlairs.com, where you can get a bunch of information plus a free preview that shows off 2 lairs that you can use right now in your game. I'm having a blast working on it with these two and so many other awesome artists and people in the community. So please go check it out. Fantasticlairs.com. We've already funded. We're blowing through stretch goals. This book is going to have so many layers in it. I'm so excited. All right, people, you can find me on Twitter at James Intricasso and at worldbuilderblog.com. Don't forget that if you've got some spare cash, you should definitely go donate to one of the organizations I talked about before we started the podcast. Black Lives Matter, Campaign Zero, Police Use of Force Project, the Bail Project, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Code 2040, Communities United Against Police Brutality, and so many more. So go check it out. I'm going to put some links in the show notes for this episode so you can go right to them that way. It's also at worldbuilderblog.com on this week's post. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network, edited by Nate Pausenga. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding DSPN with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Thanks so much for listening.
Hey there, listeners. It's Shane.
And Ishan, your hosts from the Total Party Thrill podcast, the newest addition to the Don't Split the Podcast Network.
We talk topics that help you, dear listener, create and play better RPG games.
We have a back catalog of more than 150 weekly episodes.
And we got nominated for an Emmy for episode 11, Social Contracts.
In episode 154, we talked about crossing the moral event horizon. How evil is too evil?
We also recap our home games, like the 40k Rogue Trader campaign, Dynasty Unwarranted.
But that's mainly just you trying to kill us all. In your defense, our characters are greedy idiots.
Don't forget the 3 years we spent in Eberron playing Morning Glory, your 5th edition D&D campaign.
We also review new RPGs and books, and every episode we build a 5th edition D&D character in the Character Creation Forge.
You might check out the Pint-Sized Punisher from episode 119, a halfling with a bad attitude, and 14 levels of Barbarian.
So to recap, Total Party Thrill, RPG advice, campaign recaps, and D&D characters built by your dashing hosts every single week.
What more could you possibly want?
To get back to the actual show?
Oh yeah, let me just hit this button, and here you go.